root problems that are generating the disparities in our society, because everything that's happening in our society, or at least that's been happening for the last year, has been centered around the concept of disparities. So criminality disparities, incarceration disparities, educational outcome disparities, wealth disparities. Now there are disparities related to vaccine usage, related to one's other kinds of disparities related to one's neighborhood. And I was arguing, and I have been for many, many, many years. By the way, when I use the word argue, I use that in the academic sense. So several of my academic brothers here, we know what we're talking about, but I don't sit around with a hostile demeanor. At least I don't think so. What do you think, dear? She's not going to answer that one. She's going to keep her mouth shut. So, but I've been arguing ever since Mitch Pearlstein wrote several books between 2014 and 2017, several books in which he made the case that what is really at the heart of so many of the problems here in America are and is the reality of family fragmentation. Now, the concept of family fragmentation includes lots of things. That includes the idea that people never get married. That includes the idea that people have boyfriends in and out. It includes the idea of homes where there are two people who are not married, but there's chaos in the home. And obviously it includes the idea of divorce, high rates of divorce. These are realities that literally, since I was a teen, we've been living with here in America. Those of us with grayer hair or those of us with no hair, we know this reality and we've been seeing it. And so when we either die or go to be with Jesus directly, one way or the other, if he returns and takes us or when we die, the truth of our lives will be that as Americans, we have watched America descend into a kind of social chaos that is closely related to the reality of family fragmentation. And it took a Jewish thinker, a secular Jew, Mitch Pearlstein, to make this case. And so I've been on this thing for many years. But what happened last year with George Floyd, as we unavoidably know so well, amped up the implications of this issue to a level beyond which I could never have imagined. And so now here we are, trying to face this reality. I'm gonna this is gonna be interesting to watch how this goes here. Oh, sharing screen, outstanding. Okay, so good. Okay, it's being recorded. Very good, very good. And we're now in a share screen mode. Wonderful, wonderful. Okay, so with all that in mind, I want to acknowledge to you, and most of you know, that what I've really spent the last 35 years of my life doing is working with people who are not Americans. So the fact that I'm passionate about issues here in America needs to be put in the context of a larger concern for what God is doing around the world. What I've been trying to say for at least the last 2 or 3 decades, but specifically the last 12 years since I founded Wilberforce Academy, now known as Wilberforce International Institute, I've been trying to say that God can use people from around the world who come here and who come to faith in Christ or have come with a pre-existing faith in Jesus Christ to, on the basis of a Christian worldview, find solutions to problems in their societies. In other words, to develop Christian problem solvers. We call them redemptive change agents. One of them is Waihan Liu, Donna's husband. And Donna's, by the way, right behind this whole thing. She's the person, the driving force behind asking me to come here. And I do appreciate so much, Donna. Yes, yes, absolutely. You being willing to bring this forward. And she brought the donuts and they look really good. Since I'm a sugar lover, that's actually my real problem in life. Don't ask my wife about that. In any case, I provide this photo for you to look at because this is the context in which I work. But because I'm training foreign students, and we are training foreign students to be redemptive change agents, it's self-evident that we also have to be training Americans to be redemptive change agents, right? We have got to take responsibility for the society that God has given us. So again, Kendall Qualls, Take Charge, Minnesota. By the way, pick up today's Star Tribune. First section, the A section, there's a great ad, Take Charge, Minnesota, half-page ad. You've got to see it, it's great. And then in the opinion section, his wife Sheila has written a whole article, really a paean of praise to her mother, who she said was a difficult, demanding mother. But she would suggest, and she does suggest in this, because her mother was so demanding, she went to college, she got married, she didn't have her first child till she was 30 years old. And in her Black community, that is pretty rare. So it's well worth reading and well worth picking up the Star Tribune for that today. Well, we have today and 2 more weeks together to explore this topic. And I'm going to invite you both online as well as here in the room. And I think online, probably the way we'll want to do this is to use the raised hand feature in Zoom. So I'll occasionally turn my face and look at the camera like I am now, and I'll occasionally look for a raised hand. If I don't, call on you, you can unmute yourself and shout at me, and I hopefully will listen to you then. And for the welcome the live audience here. As you raise questions, then I will repeat them for the benefit of the online audience. So what will we be doing? First of all, today we want to look at the broader issue of the challenges to the church and really to America and even to academia from the social justice movement, which I'll show you is a movement that I think is fundamentally becoming a new kind of religion. But I will also acknowledge with you in just a few minutes that I have a lot of challenges in presenting. Now, I know I'm among friends, so I figure that if bullets are flying, I'm going to hide behind most of you and you'll protect me. But the reality is that if I was speaking across the street at the U, I would have some enormous challenges. Some enormous challenges. And I want to talk about those because those of you who are teaching in the U, those of you who are administrators in the U, you have to know what your challenges are in the current environment. And I'm going to talk about the Black experience in the USA because so much of this is connected to race, but it's not only about race. This is also about sex and gender. So it's a larger platform, but the issue that has grabbed most hearts in America is the issue of race. We'll briefly introduce you to 2 of the main proponents of social justice ideology, but there are hundreds of other major ones. And then I'll help you to see what's at stake in terms of Christian Science, Christianity and science, and what I call facts here. So that's the introduction. Then next week, we'll get into the heart of what this is all about. This is a worldview conflict. This is a worldview struggle. This is something about rival ways of seeing reality. And whether we like it or not, these rival ways there's a a very large gap and gulf between these two views of reality. Social justice, or what Scott Allen calls ideological social justice, and the Christian faith that we hold so deeply. Dear, would you mind getting out my book that's in there someplace? I want to show people the book. It's in there. You'll find it. So then next week we'll talk about the worldview challenge here, and you can see. I'm going to hopefully give you some tools for really making sense of this, and to also be able to, if you were an objective Martian landing here on Earth, and none of you look like Martians, but if you were, uh, you feel like one today, is it? Oh, I see. Aliens. There you go. um, So, but if you were a Martian, you would literally have skills I'm going to teach you to be able to assess which worldview makes better sense of reality. And then the last week, we're going to dig in and talk about what are some practical solutions that we can bring as Christians to the challenge. And as you can already infer, I'm suggesting those solutions are wrapped around the idea of restoring healthy families. Now, this is a massive task. This is a task bigger than any of us, I think, can imagine. You can easily destroy something, but as most of us know, it's very hard to put something back together again. But we have no choice. And as far as I'm concerned, for the days, weeks, months, maybe years that God's given me till I go to be with Him, I want to be able to be helping to turn this train around. So, questions about where we're going in this course? Any comments, questions from any of you, online or here in person? Okay. Thank you, Paul. I love to have people who are saying that you're behind me on this. This is great. Yeah. Please do that. Will you take the bullets? By the way, you're tall enough to take the bullets from fairly high up. That's right. That's right. That's right. That's the, yeah, Chris. Thank you.
What form can you have at the university for such topics? Probably a question to ask after the last lecture, but you reminded me of that.
Yeah, so Chris McCosco has asked the question, what forums can we have at the university to engage this issue? Chris, this is one of the really difficult problems, as you know, and Andreas knows, that the university, as part of this whole social justice movement, is shutting down conversation. And so I'm very concerned about the direction that we're going in academia. It's going to take some groups inside of the university who have essentially, because of their identity, greater access to the centers of power, for those people to begin to turn around the conversation. As I'll share in a few minutes, Chris, people like you and I, and Andreas, all three of us. I don't teach any longer, by the way, to you. It's been many years since I've taught, but I have a PhD from there. People like us are simply viewed as the oppressor. And that's a very negative assessment. Paul.
I would say that sometimes the only front is the proclamation of Jesus crucified, and then this, which is discipleship, sometimes comes after. Sometimes it's before, sometimes it's after. And in a hostile environment, sometimes it's after. And whether or not you get the formal acceptance or not is
Right.
really depends on whether that message
gets through.
Where it gets accepted.
And then in the discipleship. So Paul Rutenberg was saying is that in his estimation, the only honest way that any of the rest of us can make an contribution and engage this issue at the university right now is to come in as evangelists, to bring people to faith in Christ, and then to disciple them around these kinds of issues.
And I won't hold it up as, I wouldn't say it's the only, but if there's potential that would be the right angle.
Yeah.
Different universities, different settings. It really depends.
So Paul's acknowledging there could be other opportunities. Yes, Elise.
Yeah, I just have a comment too. I just wanted to add that this social justice movement is not just affecting universities too, but it's also going to high schools and middle schools and elementary schools too, where I work. So I'm seeing it with my little kids.
You're absolutely. So Elise has just talked about that this whole movement is now sweeping through K through 12 education, and she is seeing it. You are an educator, aren't you, Elise? So, you know, and it's sweeping through the corporate world. We've seen after George Floyd the enormous movement among CEOs who you know were begging to give money to groups like Black Lives Matter. Yes, Carol. Wow. And you would know that because you're a nurse, is that right? I will. Yeah, yeah. So what Carol is saying is that healthcare, the whole world of healthcare is being affected. These are all indications. The fact that this is all showing up in multiple sectors is a very clear indication that we're dealing with something that really amounts to a kind of new religion, a new all-encompassing ideology that claims to or demands a certain kind of obedience. Kathleen.
It does point back to Jesus' teaching of do unto others as you would have them do to you.
Yeah, yeah.
So that is sort of the root of all this.
S-
Just expose the root.
So Kathleen, you said that this points back to the idea of Jesus said, what you do unto others, that will be done unto you. And so the effect of how we treat others is going to ultimately affect us. And I think what you're getting at is that we're living here in America with the consequences of the long-term slavery and Jim Crow reality. Is that right?
One of the things.
One of the
That's
things, yes.
solution though, too.
Yes.
Do to others as you would have them do to you.
So showing the grace, and as we Christians show grace, I think we're going to see others hopefully learn from the example of grace, because the tremendously ungracious spirit that I'm seeing with this movement is one that, other than coercing people to be part of it, is one that will drive most of us away. Let me tell you, we have a man living in our home. I'm not going to give his name, but he's from Persia. He's a student here at the university. He's a believer. And I was asking him what he's most proud of about being Persian. And he said, our history. Our history. It goes all the way back to and before Cyrus, who's spoken of in several of the biblical texts. And then I said, what is it today you're most ashamed of? And immediately he said, Islam. Not just because he's a Christian, but because he said almost everyone in Iran today hates the Islamic Revolution, which they view as something very separate from their lives as Persians. So this is a very, well, I'm mentioning that because coercion, when you're coerced into something, and they're being constantly coerced, and this social justice movement wants to do that with us, it does not end well. It doesn't end well. Okay, let's move on here. So what are the challenges that face our nation and our churches? And now we'll start taking off with this. But again, questions, I welcome them. I like to engage, and I really appreciated all the comments we've had already. So no question that we're dealing with the greatest racial tension since the 1960s. Those of us, again, without hair or with gray hair, we know the reality of the civil rights movement, which we view with tremendous respect. And and really a sense of adoration because of the nonviolent leadership of Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. And most of us think that America turned a huge corner in the 1960s. But what was happening at the same time in the 1960s was a sexual revolution that I will show you as we go through these 3 weeks. And some of you already have instincts about this, but I'm going to try to show you that this sexual revolution that was launched in the 1960s has tremendously undermined, in fact, destroyed the achievements of the civil rights movement. And this is why I think, when it's the combination of the sexual revolution and then the leftover residue of the racial tensions of the past, that when melded together and mixed together have part of what has led to what we have today. But it's, again, it's something bigger than just social factors. There is a fundamental ideology that's being taught here. And then finally, what we have today in the 2020s, the social justice movement, that is not only, as I said, a false religion, but it includes speech restrictions, propaganda, indoctrination. It's worsening, as I'll say, everyone's lives, and it's highly unscientific. If anything, it's extremely unscientific. I'm amazed that academia is swept along by it, because academia was known 100 years ago for its devotion to science. That was its promise in the 20th century. This is the most unscientific thing that I can even imagine, and yet it's being embraced. Well, what are my challenges, and what are the challenges of people who are like me? Well, I want to start out by talking about the elephant and the rider. Has anybody heard this term, elephant and the rider? Not, okay, you know it. Yeah. All right, so you know it too, Carol. So here's the man who made it famous. Jonathan Haidt, social psychology professor at NYU and the head of a wonderful organization that I recommend to many academics called Heterodox Academy. He's a secular Jew, not a believer by any means. But in 2012, he wrote a book that I immediately recognized, The Righteous Mind. I immediately recognized that this book was sort of a game changer. And here's why. Well, I disagree with some of his assumptions about evolution, and he's very strongly an evolutionist. And I realize among Christians there's differences on this, so I don't want to get into that. But what he had was a brilliant insight based on research, extensive research, that showed something that most of us perhaps had maybe and sort of intuitively thought was true, but we weren't sure. And he summarized this insight in The Elephant and the Rider. And what he meant by it was this. He said that the vast majority of human beings embrace a view of reality that is not a view that they have reasoned out. They haven't studied it, right? A long time, but it just suddenly hits them. And they realize, this is what I think is true about reality. It's called a moral intuition. At least that's what he calls it. Now, I'll acknowledge to you that some of this, well, let me explain the rest of this. I don't want to use my own life and my own conversion back 52 years ago as an illustration of this phenomenon. So that's the elephant. The elephant, in other words, when we embrace a view of reality, we're embracing it for usually reasons other than a well thought out rational pursuit of reality. That's the elephant. That's what carries us along. But as we move along, then the rider, which is our mind, so to speak, says, hey, I need to develop good reasons why I'm holding to this view. Now, this is all part of the challenges that I have as a presenter before you. So the rider is the reasoning process that we have. The elephant is that intuition that this view of reality is true, The writer is my mind saying, let's figure out reasons why it is true. So a few of you will remember that when I taught here 10, 11 years ago about worldviews. And I remember when I shared with students, I said, we're going to look at the 12 major worldviews on order today. The 12 major worldviews, each of them is an elephant. Okay. And I said, we're going to explore them rationally. We're going to investigate them. And I said that as a Christian, it was my responsibility to be a truth seeker. And that if I, in my pursuit of truth, decided that the elephant that I had decided to ride, which was Jesus, Christianity, if I, in my honest, rational pursuit of the truth, came to realize that it was not true, Christianity is not true, and that another faith is true, then I was prepared to abandon Christianity. By the way, I still say that, and it still shocks people. But I still remember a few people were sitting in the audience looking around and said, are we going to let him say that? But I'm committed to the idea that we must be truth seekers. That, by the way, is inherent in a Christian view of life. It's not inherent in any of the other faiths, except to some degree for scientific naturalism. So you see the elephant and the writer. The elephant is our moral intuition about what's true about reality. That's the religion or ideology we embrace. The writer is our mind trying to figure out reasons why it is true. What this means is that it's very hard to persuade you or anybody else rationally. It's really hard. And as an evangelist, Paul, you know some of the truth of that.
I ask students worldview questions. I talk to in union twice a week.
Yeah.
As many students as we can talk to.
Sure.
Sometimes it takes like 5 minutes to hear their answer. We ask like 10 questions or something.
Wow.
And what you're saying is very accurate. Most of them have not thought through what they believe. And it's sometimes like the first time they're actually thinking about the question of what will happen after they die, whether there's some sort of moral absolutes, right and wrong.
Exactly.
Kind of stuff.
Right.
And it's profound to realize how bearingless people are.
They have no bearings in reality. So it'd be better if somebody came up. Okay. Okay, so I'll do my best to translate, and then if you have longer comments or something, I'll invite you to walk up. But I'll try to summarize what Paul was saying, which is that he has discovered in doing evangelism, for example, in Kaufman Union, that as he talks with students, he gives them a list sometimes of 10 questions about what is true morally and how do you know what's true and what does it mean to be a human being. People generally have not thought about it. Students have very little ideas about these realities because they're operating primarily with emotion-based moral intuitions. So this is why this is really hard. And so what happens is that most people, if they're going to change their worldview, there has to be a crisis. So what happened last year? We had a crisis called George Floyd. That shocked people. And they jumped on and embraced the elephant called social justice without even checking it out, without even discovering its Marxist foundations, without even exploring any of it. This is what we got to do. And now our task, whether we're acting as evangelists like Paul or we're working as academicians, is to help people see, ultimately to point them to Christ. And maybe one of the things God will do through all this is that as people begin to realize that the whole social justice movement is making America worse and that it is actually destroying lives, it then might give an opportunity for the gospel like we've not had before. It may be a new door to the gospel that we've not opened before. But as I point out in the second bullet point, the stories of Kitty Genovese, this is the woman in the early 60s who was said and reported to have been murdered and raped, then murdered. Well, dozens of people looked on and never reported to the police. The story of Adolf Eichmann, the banality of evil. He was the great monster who led the Holocaust. And then the Stanley Milgram, he's the Harvard professor who did these horrifying experiments where he had volunteers administer life-killing shocks, electric shocks to people, or so they thought. Or so they thought. And, turns out they're all false stories. And I've given you the reference if you want to see about how they were all false stories. But we believe these things, and then we just ride off into the sunset thinking this is right. And it's not true. So I agree with Rod Dreher, who's written this wonderful book, Live Not by Lies, a manual for Christian dissidents. We've got to be people of truth. And I've committed myself, as things get tougher, I've got to live by truth. So the elephant in the right is the big one. So then there's another one, and that is the obvious one that I've already alluded to, that the conservative white heterosexual male, who is also Christian, is the oppressor by definition. I've been telling foreign students this now for several years, and they kind of look at me and say, what are you talking about? But that literally is the view of this movement. The oppressed, of course, are everyone else. The leaders of this movement are a couple academics. One is Ibram Kendi, but he's just one of many. He's just a much more visible leader. And you've all heard about this guy, I would suspect, how to be an anti-racist, teaching at Boston University. He's got a prime academic position in the leading academic city in America. Well, the other person is Robin DiAngelo, who talks about white fragility, she calls it, which is all part of this whole mix. She's teaching at another Massachusetts-based university, Westfield State University. So these are both academics. So you think academics, they must be right. You know, we're used to this kind of stuff in our environment. But there are many, many others like Ta-Nehisi Coates, who writes for The Atlantic and is an incredibly popular writer. Many people are required, and freshmen are required to read his book. And the list just goes on and on and on. So what I'd like to talk about finally in terms of challenges. Yeah. Yes, Phil.
Saying that, for example, these two are riding the elephant, and they're not just riding, they're directing the elephant.
They're helping to direct the elephant. They are actually helping to direct the elephant. Not just them alone, but they are the prime ones. They're the ones who are being required in all of these re-education and indoctrination sessions that every department at the University of Minnesota has to go through to be re-educated, so you're not so you become an anti-racist, which is what Kendi calls them. So yeah, this is what's going on, Phil, in our universities and other institutions. So then another challenge that is in the background, but it's a very real one, is there is a perception now, and there has been for at least a dozen years, that the Christian faith is actually a threat to humanity. This is, again, an unthinkable idea for us. But this is literally how many elite people perceive Christianity today. The old view was that we were irrational, therefore our faith should be kept private. Just don't bring it into public life. If you want to keep it private, that's fine. We don't mind you having churches. But the new view is that it's not only irrational and should stay private, but it's actually a threat to human rights and freedom. You see the difference? So it's a moral threat that Christianity represents. So new research that's being published in the next month or two by George Yancey. I know George Yancey. He's a black sociologist teaching at Baylor University. And he has discovered that as this movement, the social justice movement, is sweeping into our churches, just as it is sweeping through our society, he's discovered some very interesting realities based on some very new research. Essentially, what's happening is progressive Christians, that's the term for Christians who are tending to embrace this kind of stuff, they're basically telling their non-progressive evangelical friends that if you don't accept this stuff, I don't want to have a relationship with you. Now, I can confirm this anecdotally. We go to a small church in Roseville. It's a new church made up of 20s and 30s. Susan and I and one other couple are the only two couples over 35 there. And we're in our 70s, both couples. So it's so funny. But the point I'm trying to make is I've had a number of them say to me, I have Christian relatives, I have Christian roommates that I had in college that have embraced the stuff as believers, and they've written me off. They won't have anything to do with me. And they're hurt because they love their friends, they love their relatives. And what Yancey found is that this is happening all across America, but the opposite is not happening. And I'm not saying this just to make people like me look good, but he said the research shows that conservative, non-woke Christians are still willing to embrace progressive, woke Christians and to consider them brothers and sisters. So in other words, the rejection is coming from one side. Now that's research that I find interesting. You may find some counter research, but I think that's significant. It's going to be published this summer. And then the last challenge I have is that I have friends that disagree with me, close friends. I have one very close friend who's a very powerful official in this university. He's a believer. It's very hard. I have to write him a letter in the next month and ask if he and I can meet together to have an honest conversation about this, because I don't know how to have the conversation. He's completely on the other side on this issue. It's very tough. And maybe some of you have, whether online or in person, have friends like this who profoundly disagree with you. Phil, yes, indeed. You go ahead, take the mic and stand in front of the camera.
Okay, this really, I mean, we need to look at history. When the communists took over China, there were Christian pastors who went along with the Communist Party. Some went farther than others. There were Christian pastors who refused and went to jail. Now, are all those pastors that went along with the Communist Party going to hell? Or is God putting Christians on every side of these political controversies as salt and light to slow down the decay? If the Holy Spirit is in you and in me, and we disagree on every single point, but the Holy Spirit is in us, and we don't like each other's music, and we can't stand the pastor's sermons in each other's church, but if the Holy Spirit is there in us, we should be able to recognize that fact. And that's my problem.
Yes. All right. Very good. Thank you so much, Phil. I want to take these questions, but let me say that, Phil, and then I'll take your questions in chat. What Phil has just said, that is actually with respect to this friend that I'm talking about. That's exactly one of the things that I have to be open to, is exactly that. And I've actually asked him directly. I'm still not quite sure, but I said, are you trying to prevent worse evils from breaking out by being inside the belly of the monster? Because he's in the monster, He really is. So thank you for that. That's a very apropos comment. Okay, let's take your questions.
The first question is, please define woke and unwoke as Christians, and then is unwoke different from anti-woke?
Okay. Okay, so thank you so much for that question about defining woke, unwoke, and anti-woke. Thank you so much. Uh, no, in terms of unwoke and anti-woke, that's in my mind, at least at this point, they're the same thing. They might become different, but right now it's the same. Okay, so what does it mean to be woke? Woke is a current expression, a slang term used to describe people who have embraced the social justice movement. That is, the way of thinking about this, when you use the word woke, their consciousness has been awakened. Now, if you know anything about Marxism, you realize that one of the fundamental ideas that Marx taught was that people live with false consciousness, which he meant was that they think that they're doing well in life, but they have a false consciousness imposed on them by their bourgeoisie oppressor. But once their consciousness is awakened through communist revolution, then they will realize that I've been oppressed all along, and they will fight even that much harder to throw over the oppressor. That's where the idea comes from. So the unwoke person or the anti-woke rejects all of that. Okay. And the other question, you have one? That was it. Okay, very good. All right. So let's talk about your challenges. We have these challenges together. Will you consider the underlying worldview behind the social justice movement? That is, let's explore it. And we're going to do that next week. 2, will you give science a chance and look at the evidence? Here I am, an evangelical Christian who believes in intelligent design, which across the street would be put me in a very bad box, and I'm pleading on behalf of science right now. I'm saying the science has to be taken seriously here. 3, how will you make sense of human experience? If you default to simplistic and subjective answers, why? So as we're going to see next week, one's experience and subjectivity is so at the core of the social justice movement. Why, number 4, is this movement a threat to the USA and to the Christian faith? And will you follow Jesus to help find real answers to the real problems? There are deep problems, and we can't run from them. And in a sense, I have to admit to you that had George Floyd not taken place, I myself might not have felt the urgency, the passion, the drive to see a turnaround in especially the Black community when it comes to family fragmentation. And so I'm all on board with what Kendall Qualls is doing, and I'm asking everybody else to join his movement because we cannot fail on this issue. So here's the book that I'm recommending if you want to read this book. This book will help you a lot in understanding what's going on. This book is, a lot of people are reading this across the country. We were just in South Carolina this week with my wife's sister and brother-in-law, and they've been reading it down there, and they've shared it with other folks. Will help you a lot in gaining more understanding of what's going on with this movement. So now I'm going to need to look at the clock here. I've got probably roughly 20 minutes to talk and time for your Q&A. Terminology, we need to make sure we understand our terms. If we don't know our terms, we're going to be confused. And so I really appreciate the person who asked about what the term woke means. So the first term you'll run into when you talk in this world is the term critical theory. So this is the variant of Marxism that was actually developed by professors at the Frankfurt School in your home country, Andreas, back in the 30s, Max Horkheimer, and a variety of others. Herbert Marcuse was the the major academic who was fueling the student radicals back in our era of the 60s and early 70s. But this is a variant of Marxism that studies texts and human society based on the assumption that society is divided between oppressors and the oppressed. Critical race theory then applies this to the issue of race. And what it understands is that there is a system of white supremacy that ensures that Blacks and other minorities are systemically oppressed on the basis of their racial and ethnic identities. So then Black Lives Matter. This is a movement, as you know, but it's a movement that embodies these ideas. And it was founded only in 2013, 8 years old. Can you believe that? Just 8 years old. It's as if it's been with us for decades now. But it seeks to promote a Marxist and pro-homosexual agenda by focusing on perceived police brutality against Blacks. And I'm not going to argue about real or perceived, because I realize there is both. There is some real brutality. I think most of it's perceived and not real. If you go to their website today, you will not find evidence of the Marxist and pro-homosexual foundations. However, it was at least 5 years ago, I remember going to their website. It was plastered all over it. All over it. And I wrote actually to the editor of a major Christian news magazine. I said, you gotta do a story about this. He didn't take my advice. But, what happened is in the last year, they have cleansed their website, so you cannot see this stuff. But as you know, people have a living just taking photos of websites on a regular basis, and you can find the old versions of the website, because the real driving force is Marxist. One of the three founders, two of whom were lesbians, one is not. But among the three founders, one who was speaking for them just said in an interview in the last year, "We are trained Marxists," she said. Trained Marxist. This is not by chance. Social justice, this is labeled in the book by Scott Allen here, ideological social justice. And sometimes you'll hear me use both terms. When I say ideological social justice or social justice, I mean the same thing. This is a religion and worldview that aims to build a movement for human liberation based on critical theory. Intersectionality, this is a big one here. As you know, for those who've been following this, intersectionality is saying here that by belonging to more than one oppressed group, one experiences magnified injustice at the intersection of those oppressed identities. So we had about 2007, long before this became hot, at the University of Minnesota, I was teaching in the College of Education. We were hiring a new dean. And the simple fact is that the dean was a woman, Black, and a lesbian, who was also a Buddhist. So that was essentially, this was quadrifecta. This was the guarantee, and I'm not exaggerating. She was an impressive woman. She came from Columbia Teachers College. It was as if God had set foot into College of Education. People were in awe of this woman. Now, truth of the matter is that she was gone 2 years later, and if you want to know why she was gone, I'll tell you privately, but I won't say it here. It's not a pretty picture, though, not a good story. In any case, I'm sorry. Liberation theology is a neo-Marxist movement that reinterprets the gospel in terms of Christ overthrowing oppressors. And then white supremacy, this was the real effort prior to 1965. It was a real effort among some whites in America, not all whites, but some whites, especially in the South, where my wife is from, and Susan is from East Texas, and she will tell you that There were separate water fountains and separate swimming pools, depending on whether you're white or black. She grew up in that world. It was a real world of white supremacy. The claim is that that world of white supremacy continues fully engaged. Whether white people are conscious of it or not, it's still very much alive today, and it must be taken down. All right, so let's move on. So our racial history here in America. To talk about this, it's tough. This is actually really tough when you think about it. And then when you read some of the quotes and some of the evidence. For example, there were 4 million black slaves when the Civil War began. We know that the Civil War, there was 700,000 lives lost, mostly white lives, to fight the war, which was really over slavery, as we know. But then after the war, from 1875 to 1965, 90 years, actually, technically the last black lynching was in 1981 here in America. The last one was 40 years ago. But just think what it was to have grown up as a black person, keenly aware that your ancestors knew people who'd been lynched. It was probably a reality for many. And so this is a horrible reality. This is something that we cannot escape. This is true. And I don't think any of us wants to deny it. Question is, number 5, it was psychologically demeaning, needless to say, but number 5, is this a was reality or is it an is reality? What I mean is this the past or is it still describing the present? To listen to the vast majority of social justice advocates today, this is the America in which we live now. So I was watching a short YouTube video the other day that was made of just a few weeks ago in George Floyd's Square in South Minneapolis. And this interviewer was just asking some people who were there, well, how many black people do you think in the last year have been murdered by police in America? And they said, thousands. And as you'll see, that in just a minute, that is so far from reality, it's incredible. So people like Jamar Tisby, who is a believer, who spoke for the Greater Minnesota Association of Evangelicals recently, called Transform Minnesota, whose book is Color of Compromise, has been spread in all of our churches. I've read the book myself. When he's dealing with history, it's great. But he makes you think this stuff is happening today. And I seriously and strongly disagree. So let's try to make sense of the Black experience today. I wish that we had someone like Barbara Federico, and she might want to comment on this. She's online. Very good, Barbara. So feel free if you do want to comment. There's no question that racism is real. There are racists in America. There are racist incidents. I have a friend who lives in the far northwest Twin Cities. She and her husband are Black. They came from the New York City area. They're wonderful followers of Christ. Susan and I were with them to have dinner recently. And they talk about the racism that they experienced as they were looking for a house in the last year. And they experienced it in a far, far, far north Twin Cities suburb. So it's real. So I don't ever deny that. But is it systemic and is it pervasive? That's the question. Because I'm going to suggest that there are always bigots. And I know what it is to be on the receiving end of anti-evangelical bigotry. It's real. And I learned about that 52 years ago when I became a believer and follower of Christ. It just comes with being a follower of Christ. Black families, let's look at the brutal reality here. An abortion rate, this is my friends on Otsego, they weep over this. They literally weep over what I'm going to tell you. The black abortion rate is 5 times as high as for white women. 500. And they tell me, they're leaders in the pro-life black movement. They tell me that the research shows that abortion is traumatizing to one degree or another. It has long-term, and you would agree. So Paul is confirming that from his own studies and talking with folks. And medical people will agree with, as Carol says, that's right, it's in the literature. They have a card they give you that lists about 20 different signs or symptoms that are a result of, to some degree or another, abortion. This is a horrible reality. 75% of black children are born to single mothers in Hennepin County and in Ramsey County. Do you know what the percentage is? What percentage of children, black children, are born to single mothers in Hennepin and Ramsey County? 90%, exactly, 90%. This is unbelievable. And even among those who are married or have some sort of semblance of a halfway decent home life, there is an alarming amount of fragmentation. It's hard to find a black person who can actually tell you a story of really healthy child rearing, a healthy experience growing up. So this leads to widespread trauma. Yes, Carol, you have a question.
Going to say there's a comment in the chat that newdiscourses.com has a social justice encyclopedia that contrasts social justice use of these terms with some analysis. The authors of this site are atheists, so their commentary is not from a biblical perspective, but their critique of terms may be helpful.
Yes.
I'm reading what's in the chat for you.
Thank you. Newdiscourses.com. So hopefully those of you who are online, look at the chat, that hopefully you're able to see the chat, and it's confirming some others, even atheists, are talking about the same issues we're discussing right now. So the final issue for the black experience today in America is one of victimhood, which is ultimately, I think, as will show you, is a psychologically debilitating reality. We were not designed, God did not design us as victims. Let's think about it. Genesis 1:26. Let us make man in our image and let them rule. Now, you would think people would look at me and says, you love that kind of language. You're the oppressor. You love the language of dominion and rule. No, I just love that language because, first of all, it's God's language. And number two, it tells me that human beings were not designed to be victims. Now, it's true, in a sense, we are victims of sin and its long-term penetration into the human psyche and human behavior. That's why we need Christ. And we know that Jesus Christ changes our whole sensibility, our whole consciousness. So there is a kind of woke experience for the new believer in Jesus Christ. But it's a wokeness to be not a victim, but to be empowered to make a difference. Chris McCosker.
It's just good to think of what the word victim means.
Yeah.
It means you don't have any hope.
You have no hope. What the word, he comments, we have to think about what the word victim means. You have no hope.
It's an anti-Christian word.
Anti-Christian. Thank you, Chris, for essentially affirming that and noting that. We have to be clear about this. I will tell you, I will not say Black Lives Matter. What I say is Black Lives Flourish. And so if I was to put up a sign in my yard, by the way, I don't like that stuff, but if I put a sign up, it'll say Black Lives Flourish. By the way, all lives flourish. Everything I'm saying here, it's the university, as you know, I'd be driven out probably and beat up for saying all this. But it's true. God's goal is for people to flourish. And that's what Christ does. So let's briefly talk, and I'm keeping my eyes on the clock. the issues of race, crime, and policing in USA. Um, and I'm glad you can see this, so you can follow along. You can read ahead. Feel free to. But uh, let's start out by acknowledging that most Blacks will report to you that they or relatives have experienced having been pulled over by the police. Senator Tim Scott, who's a Black senator from South Carolina, where we were just this past week, he's a believer. He's a follower of Christ. He's a wonderful man, by the way. He's reports how he's been pulled over 6 times by the police just because he's Black. Now, I try to explain to people, when you're a policeman trying to solve crimes, and when, as you'll see here, the rate of Black criminality is so vastly higher than it is among white people, you're going to have a tendency to profile because you got to quickly find criminals. You have no time to wait. I'm not justifying all police stops. I'm really not. But we need to think about this. So, what is the number of unarmed Blacks who were killed by police in 2019? Last year, we have full statistics. 14 across America, 14 unarmed Blacks were shot and killed by police in America. Now, unarmed does not mean that they were not acting in a criminal way during the time that they were unarmed, nor does it mean that they were somehow not failing to cooperate with the police, such as what happened in Brooklyn Center recently. But this comes out to 1 in 3.5 million chance. It's probably have a better chance of being hit by lightning. 23% of fatal police shootings were Black, so that's higher than the number of, there's only 13% of Americans are Black. 23% of fatal shootings are Black. But here's the relevant statistic. 53% of known homicide offenders are Black. That's among the known. So in other words, police are actually having fewer violent encounters with Black criminals, and there's probably reasons related to what's happened in the last few years. Most of those, when you look at the police reports, who have died were fighting with the police or resisting arrest. It's not as if they were police were going out and just shooting down Black people. This is not happening, folks. And we need to be clear about that. I'm not denying that there aren't racists in America or on the police forces, but they're the exceptions. So in 2017, 9,900 Black men died in homicides in America. Only 223 were at the hands of police. So 223 minus 14, that was 2019. So there were about 210 armed Black people who were threatening police or threatening other people who were fatally shot. But the point is, the vast majority of Black homicide victims were not shot by police, nor, by the way, were they shot by white people. A police officer, according to statistics, is 18 times more likely to be killed by a Black male than is the officer to kill an unarmed, I think that means unarmed, not unnamed, but unarmed. I'm sorry about that. That was a mistake. Unarmed Black male. Furthermore, in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, which is a pretty impressive publication, no anti-Black disparity in police shootings could be found by the researchers. Again, look at the social science. We're now appealing to social science. It's pretty clear. White officers are no more likely than non-white officers to fatally shoot Black civilians. So here, number 2, I'm just going to quickly summarize. As I said, Blacks are about 13% of our population, but they are 60% of our murderers, I take no joy in any of this, because the most of the people that are murdered by Black murderers are Black people. The Black community is traumatized, largely because of Black on Black violence. This is not good. This is a terrible way to live. 45% of their 45% are felony victims. There are 60% of criminal perpetrators, and I'm not able to see that last one that I have there. So I can't tell you because I can't see that on my screen. Okay, thank you. You can see it, but I'm not actually able to see it on my screen. So homicide victims are at a rate of 6 times that of whites. So in other words, if you're a Black person, you have a 600% greater likelihood of dying in a homicide. So we have a Black granddaughter. I have to think about that. I don't want to see her die. None of you would either. No Black parent wants their child to die. No, I'm going to quickly finish up because I know I'm watching that clock. The reason I'm pointing out this man is because he's the main guy who got this going within theological circles. He was starting to do this back in the late 60s. He wrote, this is the most influential book on Black liberation theology, which is at the roots, one of the roots of today's social justice movement. This man was writing this only 5 miles from my house. I was living on a farm as a teenager in Southeast Michigan. He was teaching at a small Methodist college called Adrian College, and he was writing this book at that time. So it was happening right literally almost in my backyard. Today, we have people like Eric Mason, a graduate of my seminary, Dallas Theological Seminary, who's talking about woke church, which is advancing these very ideas, the social justice movement that I think is so dangerous. So what are the threats to Christian faith in the church? Syncretism, which is when you mix 2 opposing worldviews. Number 2, this is dividing Christians, as I pointed out in the research of Black sociologist George Yancey. This is a very serious issue, and it's going to become worse until we can turn this train around, until God does something, right? It has to be a work of God, because again, the elephant in the writer is a big issue. Just because I'm standing up here and I sound halfway credible, I hope that you think I am, it's not going to change anything in any big way. It's going to take something that only the Holy Spirit can do, and maybe another kind of crisis. But I'm really concerned about the fact that the social justice movement will diminish Christian redemptive influence in America and beyond, because the social justice Christians embrace a false diagnosis of our problems. They end up giving a faulty prescription. And if there's anything I want you to remember from what I'm talking about, it's that statement. If you get the wrong diagnosis, you're going to have the wrong prescription. That's basic science, isn't it? And I want chemists like Andreas to help save my life and the lives of my children and grandchildren and whatever else you do. I don't even know if your chemistry has anything to do with medicinal chemistry, but the point is, you get the wrong diagnosis, you're going to have the wrong prescription. So we don't have time to look at parts of this interview with Vodi Bakum, but he's a man that I met in April of 2018. I was in Zambia, and I met him there. I had heard about him. I had seen some of his stuff. He's the dean at the Dean of Theology at African Christian University in Lusaka. He was beginning to research and preparing to write a book that he's got coming out in just a few weeks. Or no, I'm sorry, it's just been published. And he's going to be basically saying the kinds of things we're talking about. And I'll introduce you to that book next week, okay? let's stop here and I'll have time for questions. Paul, yes.
Something that came to mind when you mentioned the black theology, black power, what's the guy's name?
James Cone. Yeah.
So, how there's something called black liberation theology.
Yeah, that's what it is. Yeah.
So
Right.
it contrasts something for me in late 1920s or early, I guess it's mid.
Yeah, you can come on up here. That's right.
Sure.
You can go ahead and begin your comment again, and that'd be great.
Yeah, just out of reference to the book that he mentioned uh,
By James Cone.
by James Cohen,
Cone.
Black Theology and Black Power. It it triggered my mind about I've been reading one of the biographies of um, Dietrich Bonhoeffer recently, and he came to the U.S. a couple times, but he came to New York in the 1930s, I believe it was, or it may have been late 1920s, as and as he experienced the church, there was the fundamentalists and the liberals were having their arguments and stuff in New York, and it was all power and different things. But he found his way into some of the black churches, and they were preaching a gospel of the suffering Messiah, and black people identifying with the gospel in a really healthy way. It was a powerful, truthful gospel. Whereas the German gospel, because they were so used to power, and even though they'd been through suffering, they hadn't really embraced a gospel that focused on the suffering of the Messiah and the suffering of the church. And so he was actually really empowered by the reality of their theology as they sung songs, as he heard preaching from black ministers in that time, in a oppressed people to a certain degree, right? At that time, the African Americans. So when he went back to Germany and the church got took over by Nazis, the Reich Church and um, German Christians, etc. He had this theology of suffering that was able to really influence and enable him to lead, the part of the church that didn't go into the into a theology that was based on National Socialism. So it's like the enemy, when he saw this solution coming out of the African American church, actually recognizing the true gospel and God using that, enabling the German church in different places to be empowered by that. He attempted to crush it through black theology and black power. What I see, and I don't know much about the history, so I speak as someone really far outside of the picture, but that's what I see. Yeah.
Thank you so much. You can find more about what Paul is talking about, and that's right on target, right on comment. You can find that in Eric Metaxas's book about Niebuhr, not Niebuhr. That was his professor, Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer, yeah. So that's an excellent comment. It's so ironic, isn't it, that God used their suffering redemptively in this German guy's life. So here was a German foreign student who was really helped. And
Ask people to raise their hands.
yeah, absolutely. Any raised hands? I'm not sure I'm going to see it. I don't know. Okay, very good. Okay, very good. We've got a couple minutes, I think. Is that right? And then, yes, Kathleen.
My comment is just as we've been talking about this, that why should we be surprised? Because we are all sinners.
Mhm.
Now, Jesus came to dig us out of the hole,
Yeah.
but still, I mean, sin is rampant. It's as sure as we breathe.
Yeah. So Kathleen's comment is, why should we be surprised? Because we're sinners and it's rampant. This is what's going to happen. And so true. Absolutely. Sin is, I wish we could escape it. We're waiting for Jesus to return and take us. Yeah. Yes, Waihan, my brother. Yeah, feel free to come up here, brother. He does a good job on the stage anyway. I assume there's time for his comment, and then we need to wrap up. Is that right? Okay.
Yeah, I think it is a very interesting topic about the culture we have. Um, because I work in a charter school, I think the reason why I work there so that I can uh, be a salt and light there. It's very hard for Christians to bring witness in public school because of the political thing, and I can really sense the pressure of the curriculum. They want to change the curriculum. They want to change everything. So I think as for my side, I have to be very careful. How am I going to play a role and not being seen as a Christian? Try to push my agenda. There's some of my teachers and they know I'm a teacher. I'm a Christian. So I just want to encourage all of you who are in education profession or in science or whatever. This is your time. This is our time. I think just want to read something to encourage all of you. Live wisely. Colossians chapter 4. Live wisely among those who are not believers and make the most of every opportunity. Let your conversation be gracious and attractive so that you will have the right response for everyone. I think the serpent, the devil is very smart, so we as Christians must continue to be wiser. If not, we will be confused by the movement of the world. I see a lot of Christians, they are taking, a different route, and it's just very hard. So we need to be wiser.
Great. Thank you so much, Waihan. It's a big sphere. Yes, question. Quick question. Okay, Hassan, quick
Yes,
question from you.
if you look at what you said is right, but you should check the root. What is the problem? I think because the black people less education than one people and white people, and black people have a most financially than our white people. If you there are most poor than white people. So this is the reason they have more involved with policemen, more involved with the, there are
Thank,
more killing. This I think there is
thank you so
certain
much.
root
Very
financially
good.
and less education than white people.
Exactly. So Hassan, thank you. I'm sorry that I have to cut you off. We're just having to end this class,
Okay.
but let me just say that you're right on target. We'll deal with that in the next 2 weeks. We'll explain that issue much greater. So thank you so much. All right. Well, God bless you. Thank you for this time together.
Let me just say thank Bob for coming, and we'll look forward to next week. And so we'll go for worship. Thank you.